Hi there, and welcome to another BigLipz podcast. My name is Sam and Blair, and as ever, I'm joined by the wonderful Kathryn Maurice. The two of us are two independent filmmakers who basically decided to start our own YouTube channel, and we began by talking about movies, and now we're on our second series of our podcast in which we talk about television. So this month, we're doing things a bit differently. This is a bit of a belated episode, but we've got one theme that we're sort of splitting in two, and this is going to be the first episode, with the next two follow soon after. So the topic this week is quite a big staple of television, which is cliffhangers, which is quite an exciting one to tackle. With intros out the way, Kathryn, how would you sort of describe a cliffhanger? What is a cliffhanger to you?
I think for me, in the most kind of basic terms, it would be it would describe like a plot point in a TV show, normally occurring around the kind of either mid-season break or season finale or penultimate episode normally. And it's pretty much just a plot point that's normally a twist. But it also kind of like it's so shocking, but then it comes right at the very end of the episode, so that's you're left hanging, hence hits in the name. So basically you'd get some kind of shocking news or info or revelation that and then, as I was saying, the show kind of that episode instantly stops, so you're kind of left with not knowing how that's going to affect different people, different plot points, the fallout from that, if you're going to get the rest of the info, because sometimes like plot points, cliffhangers would be like if a character was shot and you didn't see who did it, and then that gives you yes, it gives you time to kind of speculate. It's a good way to it's that kind of like inclusive element thing that we were talking about before, where it just kind of draws you in. You can then start to try and figure out what's happening with other people, which I always think, obviously we've got a whole podcast dedicated to talking about film and TV, so it's always fun to do that. Cliffhangers are a really fun way to do that as well. I feel like they can be super serious and super dramatic and the stakes are really high, but at times they can be not as dramatic and then it's a bit more lighthearted, like if something's really ridiculous. It could be quite a funny cliffhanger. I feel like, though, having said that, and we've brought this up so many times, but obviously the way that we watch TV now is different. So I feel like maybe nowadays it wouldn't have as much of an effect as it did maybe kind of previously. Although, having said that, there are a lot more shows on streaming services that are coming out like weekly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of maybe not, it's definitely not the same as when you would watch it on the TV and you would need to wait until next Friday at 9 or whatever to find out what happened. So yeah, I feel like that kind of idea where we binge watch things, it kind of, like, I almost feel bad for the writers. Like, if you've put so much thought into your cliffhanger and then people just don't leave any time for it to stew, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I always feel like even if I'm watching a TV show, if I'm binge watching it, if I finish one season, I like to leave at least a day so that I can just let it sit and stew and process and everything and then go back to it. But I think I'm pretty weird on that, so I don't know if other people would do that if they saw a cliffhanger. And I suppose that would be the mark of a good cliffhanger, where if you had the opportunity to watch it straight away, if you were like, you genuinely couldn't wait. But that might just be people with no willpower as well. So I feel like as well, there's such scope for them to be so good. Even now, there's obviously like we've spoken a lot about TV. Obviously, there's like, it's been around for a while, so like stories are going to tend to repeat themselves. But I feel like there's still a lot of scope for it to do something really quite interesting with it. Especially nowadays, we've spoken about like the way that writing's changed in TV and things like that. So I feel like there's a lot more. There's definitely scope there for it to be for there to be really interesting ones and kind of out there. But in that kind of vein, I feel like there's also a lot of scope for them to be ridiculous. But I feel like that's funny as well, because when there's a cliffhanger that's ridiculous, I feel like a lot of people know about it. it also becomes its own kind of talking point.
Yeah.
But I feel like as well, there's the fear that if it happens too often, if a series runs for too long, and we've spoken about it like when we were discussing when to kind of, or what show to do this podcast on this topic, we were talking about, oh well, you know that a show is probably going to have a cliffhanger mid-season break or a penultimate episode, do you know what I mean? So it gets very like, I find even when you're binge watching things, I can find you can tell what episode you're on.
Yeah.
You're like, this feels like a mid-season break point because of the cliffhangers. So that's an interesting point, actually, that they're like almost like a bookmark for you to judge where you are in the series. But yeah, sorry, that was a huge, long, rambling explanation.
No, not at all. And I mean, I asked the question. And to be honest, you touched on a lot of things there that I kind of want to elaborate on, because the sort of ideas similar to what I kind of had in my head, and just discussion points in general. Like, I feel like examining cliffhangers within the ecosystem of television is really interesting. And without actually having done any like proper research into this, purely based on like cliffhangers anyway. But like obviously basically studying TV, both like educationally, professionally, and also just for fun.
Yeah.
I feel like cliffhangers, kind of existed. The whole thing comes from like, what was it, matinees? The old shows that they used to show that like way back in like, was it the 20s or something? Maybe even like maybe later than that. They used to show like these like mini serials in the cinema, and they would put like cliffhanger endings so that people would come back next week and watch these like pulpy wee adventures. Yeah. I think that's where like cliffhangers basically started, and then I think TV probably when that began kind of just poached that from like pre-existing kind of, I guess, from that, because it was like it was short adventures that were continuous, so it makes sense kind of like steal it, and I guess that's the thing is like they are very much like cliffhangers are marketing, aren't they? They really exist to get you not just watching the show next week, but they are designed to generate buzz. You want people talking about the show, they want people speculating, and I do think that's part of the fun. That's exactly what they're designed to do, but they do it very well, or they can do it very well, and I think that's so much part of the fun is like when you don't know what's going to happen next. I guess it's the thing with like the internet and stuff now. There is the hub that exists now where you can go online and you can read like literally a million theories. Mere minutes after like an episode has finished. Whereas like before, you'd maybe just have like yourself and your friends, if that, to like discuss cliffhangers with. And yeah, I guess you would. Now, I don't know if you would get more interesting like discussions then, because you only had like your individual references to go off of. You probably would be surprised more often. I feel like it's when you have this collective like mass of people that are sort of speculating on something, you're more likely to kind of figure out the solution. I think TV shows have really kind of struggled with that. I think that is like probably one of the reasons that the cliffhanger has kind of like not died a death, but it's not, it has declined in prominence. Because like I think there's an example I want to talk about later on, which is maybe like the perfect case study for this. Anyway, I think cliffhangers as they used to, I think cliffhangers have evolved in my eyes from what they were. And I think they've always been a tool, but they used to have these like massive, colossal like event cliffhangers, like you say, like sort of around mid-season finales and like towards the end of a season. I think what's interesting is you get shows that will have mid-season cliffhangers and like series finale or penultimate episode cliffhangers. Sometimes like the very last episode will be a cliffhanger to get you back for the next series. But you get some shows that obviously rely on a cliffhanger at the end of every episode, but you get other shows that use them sort of sparingly. And I think it's quite interesting, that sort of disparity between like shows that actually actively seem to rely on like cliffhangers every single week, and shows that kind of like bring them out for like big occasions. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. But I feel like you mentioned binging and you mentioned Netflix. I feel like weirdly cliffhangers are actually one of the reasons that like Netflix took off and binge watching became a thing. Because like you kind of need that's what it kind of preyed upon, wasn't it? Was that whole, oh, we'll just stay up and watch like this one more episode. It's the same with
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
like reading chapters in a book where you just want to read the next chapter and know what's going to happen. And I feel like it's very much the same kind of thing, and that is how binge watching became a thing, and that's how Netflix managed to sort of create this model where it would just drop entire seasons and people would be done and talking about it within like days.
That's such a good point, actually, because I feel like it's like you're saying, it's such a clever way and such like a relatively easy way in terms of like, it's a lot of story work obviously, but you don't have to put in huge amounts of like marketing or whatever, so it's a relatively easy way to get people to keep watching. So I feel like maybe like what I was saying about the binge watching thing, it's maybe just force of habit now that we binge watch things even when they're like, I know myself in my soul that I've sat and watched entire seasons of shows that have been boring, and I've just watched them just because it's like, oh yeah, I'll just watch the next one, and I'll just watch the next one, I'll just watch the next one. But I think you made a really good point about like how it's evolved. It definitely has, I feel. But for good or bad, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, again, we talked about this before, but TV sort of being cyclical, and we're coming back to that like weekly release, that sort of weekly release template or formula, and I guess as a result, we're kind of coming back to. I feel like we could be coming back to like the cliffhanger again being a bit more of a prominent thing. Definitely does feel like. I guess it feels like we are seeing. You know, TV is still being treated as a bit of an event, and you do have shows like maybe The Mandalorian that will drop in these like big surprises, maybe not as cliffhangers, but within the episode, so that like people feel inclined to watch them sort of upon release. Yeah, it's interesting. I do think the cliffhangers evolved. I think it's not as dramatic as it used to be, and I think that can be a good thing. I think it's kind of like moved on from that phase, and you get maybe more nuanced cliffhangers where it's more about like, it maybe makes more of like a sort of thematic point, or like, you know, leaves you with an intriguing question, but it's not about like, oh, there's this like burning question that you have to have like answered, or this character's in like imminent peril. You know, it doesn't feel as cheap, I think. Just out of curiosity, what would you say you prefer? Like, do you prefer shows where they have a cliffhanger, where they use that, or where they kind of wrap things up?
I feel like I love me some like trashy dramatic telly. So I definitely like, I've spoken obviously about it before just because I'm like watching it just now, like binge watching it just now, but like Grey's Anatomy is a big one for their terrible cheesy spoilers, and my fiance always makes fun of me because something will happen, this cliffhanger will be set up, and then he always makes fun of me because he's like, oh, what's gonna happen? Like, because it's so formulaic now, but there's a little bit of me that loves it. That's the little bit of me that's embarrassed. But you know, but I do appreciate. We've spoken obviously about writing before. I do appreciate the more kind of subtle, like, you know how obviously we didn't really live through it, but like before when there was TV shows like, I think was it Dallas, and it was like in the papers, like who shot whatever the person's name was. Like I love the thought. I love the thought that it would be in the papers, like like, and everyone would be discussing it that way. So yeah, in conclusion, I'm not sure. I've started to go off on a tangent there again. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. But you're right. Like, like we've come a long way from cliffhangers literally being in the papers, and yeah, there is. I think you say like Grey's Anatomy. I don't watch it, but I can imagine. I mean, even just thinking back, I guess to like, I remember watching bits of like shows like you know, Desperate Housewives when I was younger, and that's a show. That's a show that loves a cliffhanger.
That is Oh yeah. Desperate Housewives is like almost like Grey's on steroids. Like, it knows that it's ridiculous, which I appreciate. If you're like, they've decided this is what we're going for, and we're gonna go hard, and you have to appreciate them for that.
Yeah, it knows exactly what it is, and it wears it in its sleeve. And that goes right down to the name, doesn't it? So I so much respect for that show. So I guess like, we've already kind of started on this, but what do you have any examples of like some great cliffhangers that you've sort of experienced in your life? Cliffhangers that have like really sort of stuck with you, or ones that have maybe been like genuinely like, you know, are really difficult. Like, you know, you're like, I need to know what happens next. I actually cannot wait.
Yeah. So we'll start, of course, with Grey's. And this one is in the first season. and I'm sure it was a mid-season break point. And basically, like, the entire first half of the season was them kind of building up Derek and Meredith's relationship, and it wasn't going to work, it was going to work, it wasn't. And then finally did come together, and they were like, yes, let's make it work. This is great. We've got a good thing going here. And then at the very end of the episode, they're standing to leave the hospital, and Derek turns around out of nowhere and apologises to Meredith. And then this woman approaches them, and she's like gorgeous and glamorous and tall, and she's got this amazing hair. And she comes up to them and she utters the most amazing, iconic phrase in Grey's history. And she turns to Meredith and says, "You must be the woman who's sleeping with my husband." And it's such I remember watching it at the time, and it was so shocking. Like, oh my God, Derek, this perfect man, is married. And then that was it. The episode, you just poor Meredith's face, and then it like cut. I feel like that's that perfect example of that dramatic kind of like over the top type cliffhanger, but it definitely made me want to keep watching. So I was like, oh my God, he's a wee snake. I can't believe he had a wife. And then it kind of, like I was saying earlier, it does that nice thing that cliffhangers, I feel, should do in some respects, is that it kind of presents more questions than it answers, obviously. So you're like, oh, are they still together? Why is blah blah blah? So I feel like cheesy as it is, I feel like that's a very good example, and it definitely did stick in my mind. Another one in a completely different vein is from Sherlock, and that is when Holmes fakes his own death. I remember watching this at the time and being absolutely shocked, like, and genuinely thinking, surely, because I feel like we've been conditioned potentially by the ridiculous things where there's a lot of like, oh, yes, he fell off the roof, but there was a giant mattress below him. Like, do you know what I mean? We're so used to these cliffhangers, and then almost being disappointed by just poor writing, basically. But that came quite late in the series. I'm sure you might be able to tell me better. I think, was it season 3?
Oh, season 2. It's a halfway point, season basically.
So up until that point, obviously it was good because we'd experienced how clever the show was. So there was a little bit of you that was like, they very much presented that he is dead, but at the same time you were like, but surely not. But then I remember this kind of back and forth, like, no, he definitely can't be dead. But then I was like, but like, it really looks like he might be. And then you were like, oh, but Sherlock Holmes as a character would probably do something like that and be able to get away with it. But then for me anyway, I was like, but how? Do you know what I mean? Like, so I feel like that was a great one. I feel like it was, that one in particular as well was a testament to the writer. Very, like, each character was so well developed that it almost felt on brand for Holmes, which I think is really important for cliffhangers, that it's not completely out of the blue. Like, it needs to be, or it does turn into that really ridiculous, like, you want to give up watching it because everything you know up until that point is just being completely disregarded.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was another one.
Just while you're on it, I guess it's probably easier to jump on it now. Yeah, that was one of the ones that I had listed as well. Was the cliffhanger of the Reichenbach and that was the one that I kind of that to me was the one that I was hinting at before when I was mentioning there's an interesting case study regarding like big scale cliffhangers, because I think, like you say, like, yeah, it was executed pretty perfectly. I think the interesting thing about it as well is, like, if you know anything about the books, so originally, just in case you don't, or for anyone watching that doesn't really know much about the Sherlock Holmes books, I haven't read them. I've know this from just started reading up them, stuff around.
Which is funny.
Oh really? That's well, slight kind of book spoilers then. But it's more.
I mean, I've seen the movies and the show, so it was already.
It's more to do with like this. Yeah, it's more to do with like the story around the writing of the books, because basically, like, the I think it's called The Final Problem, the book in which the Breaking Back fall actually happens, like the Sherlock Holmes story, and that the whole point of that book, when it was like written and when it was released, was Arthur Conan Doyle, who obviously wrote and created Sherlock Holmes. He was basically fed up of Sherlock Holmes' popularity, He just wanted done with the character, wanted done with the book series. I think there's actually a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle somewhere where he said that if all he was ever remembered for was writing Sherlock Holmes, he'd consider his life a disappointment. So he'd be
Amazing.
turning in his grave.
Yep.
But basically, so he just wanted done with the character. So the Writing Back Fall was, Holmes and Moriarty, and Holmes basically grabs Moriarty and the two of them jump off a waterfall, and that was supposed to be it. Like, that was literally that's the character dead. That was the whole point of him writing that. And I think that's kind of what Misery kind of touches on that. The Stephen King book. That whole idea of like, in that he's like killed off as the character, and then she forces him to basically, and that's kind of what happened. Was like, Conan Doyle, there was then so much pressure put on him by like his readers to do more Sherlock Holmes. I think he ended up doing Hound of the Baskervilles as like a sort of prequel story, and then that wasn't enough. So I think they were like, no, you need to bring him back. So he ended up writing The Empty House, which was his way of kind of bringing the character back. And I don't think, from what I know, I don't think he ever really explains in the books how
How he comes back.
Yeah, I think he just kind of is back. I think he's just like, I survived, and brushes it off, and just people were just like, well, we've got more Sherlock Holmes, so we're happy. I don't think, because it obviously wasn't a planned thing, that's why it was kind of this like impossible to survive situation that he then just kind of had to ignore. So
Love it.
But it makes the episode itself more interesting, because it totally toys with that. It kind of does the same thing, where it presents this like impossible to survive situation, which should be the definitive end of the character, where he jumps off a roof, and his best friend sees him hit the ground and die. You see him hit the ground and die. So it's very much like played in such a way that it's like, okay, this is the end of the character. If you know anything about the books, then okay, well, this is actually how he was killed off in the book. So it's very plausible this is the end. And then obviously they have that brilliant reveal at the very end of the episode, where Watson's been like sort of mourning at his grave, and then the camera pans round and you see that Holmes is alive and well and watching him. And it's just it's so good, because it's just like you get that one visual, and that's the cliffhanger. And the question is like, okay, well, how did he do it? Which is such an interesting place to leave it, because I guess that's almost like an evolution of the whole, cliffhangers for a very long time are just a character dies or they're in imminent peril, and that's like, maybe like 20 years before, the cliffhanger would have been Sherlock jumps off the roof, or Sherlock, has to jump off the roof.
It's just kind of like evolved now. I definitely feel like obviously that's definitely a testament to the writing. Obviously, like you're saying.
But I feel like that to me was like one of the last, like, and granted it was like a 3-year wait or something, 2-3 years wait for like the next series for them to actually resolve the cliffhanger. But I do feel like that was one of the last major cliffhangers where like people were so invested in talking about it, and it really was this like, there was just like the wildest conspiracy theories over like.
Was there not like a really funny bit in the show where they talked about like almost like fan theories, and I remember there being a really funny bit where it was like Holmes and Moriarty were like secretly lovers.
Yeah, well that basically, because they said after basically, and because obviously they wrote the episode, like they knew how the character was going to survive, but they actually like modified part of like the solution, because like it's one of those things where, and I guess the interesting thing about working in TV, where they had no idea just how big that cliffhanger was going to be. Because it's a cliffhanger at the end of season 1, and it's the same kind of thing where that's more like a classic cliffhanger where, there's a bomb and there's guns and the characters are in like mortal peril, and it's how they're going to get out of that. And there was a tension around that, and I remember people sort of speculating on that one. But it was very much just like, people were interested, but that was it. But there was like almost a religion around how Holmes survived this fall, and I think they kind of realised that when they were bringing it back. They were like, okay, this has become such a big thing. It's become like such. It's like developed a life of its own that we can't not acknowledge it, and just like like how preposterous some of the sort of fan theorising has got. But anyway, so just since you'd mentioned it, I wanted to jump on that one.
Very interesting points. Another one I wanted to mention, and I'm pretty sure you've said you didn't watch this show, but it happened quite early on in, I think it must have been season 1 of Lost. And Lost is obviously famous for like already being quite difficult to follow, and I feel like cliffhangers were like, I mean, if you've watched the show, there's definite like highs and lows. But season 1 was a definite high, and the particular cliffhanger that I'm talking about is Locke, one of the characters. He's quite like philosophical. He believes, hence in the name, John Locke. He believes that like things happen for a reason, blah blah blah. So they stumble across this hatch in the forest in the middle of this desert island, and he basically is like, oh, I need to get in here, it means something, I found this for a reason. And this goes on for like 3 or 4 episodes, and everyone else in the camp is like, John, just leave it, like, who cares, it's just a hatch in the floor. And then this carries on for so long, and then he's finally has a breakdown, and he's like, maybe it doesn't mean anything, maybe my entire life has been pointless and useless, which is interesting as well, because that's how John was feeling like before the crash, because obviously you get the flashbacks, and he was having those kind of, and when he got to the island, he got some kind of new lease of life, and he appreciated things, and then that's been broken down again from this hatch. So he's having his breakdown, he's at the hatch, he's banging on it, and then all of a sudden from nowhere, this giant like spotlight, there's a tiny window in the hatch, and this giant spotlight comes up and just like illuminates the entire forest right in his face, and that's when it cuts. So you're like, oh my god, he was right all along, there is something down there, because so many people in there, logically speaking, why would there be anything in there? It's like a deserted island, they're stranded there, why would there be anything of worth or value in there? So that moment is like a nice, like we're saying, it starts questions of, oh, what is in there? Is it a person? Is it something on a timer? Is it just a lamp? Like, what is it that's in there? And the answer to that is crazy. So like, I couldn't
Well,
even.
Don't. Yeah, I was gonna say, don't tell me, because I am going to watch Lost.
Yeah, I couldn't even go, like, it would be the entire length of the podcast me describing.
Fair.
So yeah, that's definitely a good one. I didn't know you were going to watch it, so I'm glad I didn't pick anything else. Another one I wanted to mention, of course, how could I not talk about The Simpsons?
Yep.
An iconic Who Shot Mr. Burns. That's like the exact example that we were talking about, where it's like super cheesy, but I feel like it obviously works for...
That's interesting, because they basically just took... I mean, the whole point is they're parodying the Who Shot JR thing, isn't it? So they literally just copy that cliffhanger. But that one's so interesting, because like it also became so big itself.
Yep. I feel like I've actually written that in my notes. Like, even if you don't watch The Simpsons, you know about the Who Shot Mr. Burns episodes. It's such like a fun... That was kind of when Simpsons was at its peak, when it was fun and clever, and I feel like there was like a little bit of like the kind of genuine mystery. Like, you were like, oh, who did shoot Mr. Burns? And then in true like Simpsons fashion, it was a baby. Like,
Out of curiosity, just out of curiosity, how long did you wait? So what was your like context of watching this like episode, this cliffhanger?
For the Mr. Burns one?
Yeah.
I must have watched, definitely think I watched it as a child, and I either didn't, because obviously The Simpsons tends to play, and like they just play whatever episodes, or it certainly did when I was young, but I feel like I definitely didn't know Who Shot Mr. Burns when I watched the first one. And I'm pretty sure it was a discussion in the house, like, who do you think it was? And it would have been this person, that person, or the next thing. I feel like it would have been really fun to watch it, like, as it aired.
Yeah, because... but I mean, did you like, because the reason I'm asking is easier to explain my side, and then for clarification, because I had the same experience where I watched it. I think I watched it with my best friend Joanne, and my brother, and I think her sister. I think we just watched the kids, and we'd watched The Simpsons together after school. And yeah, I remember watching it, and I remember I was sitting there going like, oh my god, who do we think it is, and like speculating. But like you say, I think The Simpsons used to just play on Channel 4. They used to just literally like, it's like they spun a wheel and they just picked episodes.
100%. I feel like it's a bit more uniform now, but it definitely as a child it was random.
So I don't think it was like, I think it was genuinely like, it wasn't a case of like, well, I'll watch it tomorrow or the next night and I'll see the next episode.
Oh, like how long did I have to wait?
Yeah, because I think I genuinely just, it was like, honestly, like I couldn't even tell you how long, but like a considerable chunk of time later, and it just randomly happened to be on. I think I might even not even have seen the full episode. I think I maybe just caught the back half, and I was like, oh, that's what it was.
There's Who Shot Mr. Burns.
Yeah.
No, I honestly can't remember. I don't think it was that far apart. Because when you watch them separately, they're quite. It does kind of like recap in the episode, but the second episode is quite weird, and obviously you see like Smithers' point of view when he's drunk, and then the old man who gets shot in the wooden leg. So yeah, I feel like I would have remembered, but if I had watched them at different times, like you're saying, because that second episode's a bit jarring.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would have loved to have seen that at the time. I read somewhere that they did, when it was airing, they had done a competition in America where you could write in, and if you guessed correctly Who Shot Mr. Burns, you won whatever it was, and no one guessed the baby.
Love
Shocker,
that.
because that's not a real, like it's, you might as well have guessed the dog.
Yeah, the card basically wasn't on the table.
Yeah,
which
100%.
it makes it very clever, and it's very Simpsons. It's what I guess it's the perfect thing for a comedy to do, isn't it? It's like subversion in the most interesting way. But I guess that's I'll save those thoughts for later on.
Yeah, this one I just want to mention these next ones briefly because when I was writing my notes, I was like, God, yeah, there's another good one. There's another good one. That's another good one. Another one was in ER. I can't remember what season it was, but basically one of the patients just went rogue and was stabbing the doctors. But so basically it happened that one of the doctors went into the room, the patient came up behind him and stabbed him, and when he fell down onto the floor, he was of course lying face down looking under the bed, and as he looked over, one of the other doctors was already lying there having already been stabbed. Yeah, and then it kind of cut from there. So that one was a good one because it was quite scary.
Yeah.
I watched it when I was relatively young, so it was quite scary. It was shocking as well. These were characters that you actually cared about. And then because it kind of was episodic, the way it was released, there was a lot of uncertainty. You didn't know whether this guy, because after one of the Dr. Carter fell, you didn't see what happened to the patient that was stabbing them. You just saw like him and the other doctor, so you didn't know whether he was loose in the hospital. So yeah, that was a good one. That one's always kind of stuck out as well.
Nice.
And then this next one, this is a weird choice, but I feel like it needs discussed. And that is, of course, The Walking Dead, as in who did Negan kill?
Yeah.
I feel like obviously I knew one of the people that he killed because it became such a meme. And I'm gonna spoil it because we've spoiled Walking Dead enough, but obviously it was Glenn.
Obviously.
Yeah, and I feel like there was that, but I feel like maybe if you were watching it at the time and if you were invested, it would have been really it would have been exciting because I do appreciate that they killed one of the more like main characters.
Yeah.
I hate when there's a cliffhanger and all they've killed off is like the person that was introduced 2 episodes ago.
Yeah.
It's so like the stakes are so low in that sense, and I feel like they kind of, I mean, I liked Abraham as a character. He was fine, but he did feel like more of an outsider than it would have been more shocking had it been Rick or Carl. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like that one's not necessarily my favourite or least favourite. I just felt like it needed discussed.
Yeah, no, it's another like I completely agree. It's another like that was another seismic one that has like of recent years where kind of has been discussed. Are there any shows that you've watched like say within the last like year where there's been like a cliffhanger and you've been like, oh okay, like here we go.
It's not boding well that nothing's jumping out at me.
Yeah. I guess I mean like
I don't know. I'm struggling. Yeah, I'm struggling to think of shows that I've watched that are like that would have those kind of cliffhangers.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I have one. Just only say because I've got one from this year, and it's an interesting one because I'm not going to say like I'm not actually going to provide the context or like what happens, But Better Call Saul had its last season, and I mentioned it I think in the last podcast, and genuinely like one of the very best TV shows ever made by like a considerable distance. It is like unreal how good that show is. But they basically, I think, Bob Odenkirk unfortunately had like a heart attack when they're filming it, so production was like stalled. So what they did was they decided to start airing the final season, and then they were going to do like a mid-season split, because it was like I think episode 7 was when they split it. That's where like the first part of the season ended, and that because I think it's when they're filming episode 8 that Bob Odenkirk had the heart attack. So then like episodes 8 to 13 a couple months later, started airing, and then the show finished. I think it pretty much was just like sheer chance has happened. But episode 7 ends on like a jaw-dropping note. And I think what made it so good was like the writers and like producers and stuff kind of said, they were like, oh yeah, there's going to be like a bit of a mid-season cliffhanger, but like it just but don't expect anything that big, because like Breaking Bad, its final season had like a mid-season cliffhanger, and there was like a huge cliffhanger there. So they were like, don't expect anything. This wasn't planned. Like it was just like a thing that happened. And I remember going online after the episode because everyone was just like, what the hell? They underplayed that so much, and it was massive.
I love it. What a power play!
Honest to God,
they must have known how good that was. I wonder if they were just like, do you know how sometimes if you're a wee bit self-conscious about things, you're like, oh, it's nothing really.
Yeah, no, literally, and it was so well done because of the fact it was like underplayed, and that they went the other way rather than like hyping up this cliffhanger like most shows do. They went the other way, and they like totally downplayed it, and it was terrific. Like it's such a good. It feels like it was engineered, and the way that the show responds to it as well is just like so interesting. So yeah, no, that would be like my recent pick.
What a conveniently timed heart attack.
I know. Thank you, Bob Odenkirk.
Good thing that he is fine and dandy now, though. It would have been so much worse had he not been.
I know. Well, yeah, that was like one of the...
distasteful to talk about it.
Yeah, it would be a very different tone. I'd be wearing black right now.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the nice thing about it was that I remember being online at the time, and there was just like this outpouring of like love for him, and it was just really nice to see like there was just like, this unanimous like support for the guy, and he is like again probably one of the best actors out there. Not that that's his worth as a person, but it was just like was just like a lovely thing to see. So yeah, and again, I'm also very glad he's okay. Cool. So yeah, one other cliffhanger I want to touch on briefly, and again, it's interesting. Actually, there's two more I wanted to mention now that I think about it. But it's interesting that one thing you kind of touched upon is the fact that like I feel like cliffhangers are more sort of exciting when you're younger. But again, I think part of that was also just the separation from like the internet and not being able to, even with shows like The Simpsons, that you're watching this years after it came out, but there's no way to actually just go online and see what happens next or read about what happens next. You're in more of a vacuum from these things. And I guess things like YouTube and stuff didn't exist, where like you kind of have like best cliffhanger lists and maybe just like other media that reference these things more like sort of freely. So
I think it would have been slightly odd as a child as well. Like, Mum, can I use a computer? And then we like best cliffhangers.
Yeah. No, but I mean, YouTube suggests things, so you never know.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
I think so. One that I do remember sticking out as a kid, and it is like such a part of the show, but it's Doctor Who, where like the first time where Christopher Eccleston regenerated into David Tennant, and that just like is such a particular thing for that show, that just that show has, that like no other show does, and I think it's like one of the cleverest ideas any TV show's ever had, is the idea of like regeneration, where basically the show just admits to the fact that it's recasting its lead character, and it just the show basically just goes, don't worry about it, we're just cool, it's done.
Yeah, it's good here, don't worry.
Yeah, it's done. Forget about it.
It's very clever, because then it's just like there's no time limit on the show. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. So yeah, like so much respect to the show for that idea, but even what makes it even more interesting is the way that they, because the whole point is really like you need to, it's like such a big change to go through, and you would think that maybe like the show would do it in a way where it eases you into the new actor and makes sure that you're comfortable with the new actor, and then it kind of like leaves you, but like what they do, and I think they did it in the classic series, but obviously they definitely do it with the new one. But yeah, basically David Tennant just kind of appears, says a few lines, and then that's it. Like you have literally like
That's amazing.
the smallest of scenes, and it wasn't even like, okay, that's it till next week. It's like that's it until like next year when the show comes back. Basically, you have like, and as a kid, that is like a colossal weight.
That's quite ballsy as well. Like,
yeah,
there's no guarantee that you're gonna come back.
exactly. And I genuinely, I remember like really not liking David Tennant in his first like scene because I was just like, I was like, this isn't the guy that I'm watching
Yeah,
as
that's
the
fair.
main character of the show. Like he literally has just changed. And it's it's a really weird thing to try and get your head around, and the show doesn't give you any time to get your head around it. So yeah, no, that to me was like, I just remember it just like kind of blowing my mind that it did that, and that like knowing that when the show came back, it wasn't going to be the same show. So yeah, I feel like that one definitely. Doctor Who's an interesting one with cliffhangers because it is one of those ones that uses them kind of sparingly, and there are some like great cliffhangers in there. There's one season. Where they had like an episode that you didn't know. I think they'd only ever done 2-parters, and then they had an episode. One of the season finales was like a 3-parter, but they didn't tell you the first part was like the first part of the finale. So that just out of nowhere had this massive cliffhanger, and you were genuinely at the time you were like, whoa, what was that? So it was a show that messed with your trust.
That's pretty cool though. That's a fun way to do it.
Yeah, again, I like shows that do it interestingly. And another one, I guess, the other one that I wanted to talk about, which is what reminded me was, and I did this backwards. Doctor Who took a lot of his DNA from Buffy, and obviously Buffy had its like spin-off show Angel, and I recently watched Buffy and Angel. I watched it during the pandemic, and I binged it all. Well, kind of. I watched it over like 6 months, so like sort of binged it. I didn't watch it in like
it's a long show.
yeah. Like I watched it faster than people who watched it as it was coming out, but I also didn't watch it as fast as like people can watch it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was. Again, I won't spoil it because again, I know that you started Buffy. And
I have seen a big Buffy spoiler that was in some of the lists I was looking at, which does involve Angel. But do you know what's funny? I did see the Angel ones on list, and I was like, quickly scrolling by them. Like I will get on it, I promise.
Well, there's one cliffhanger, and I don't even think. I think it's a really understated cliffhanger. It's not all that. It is really dramatic, and it's not. It's weird to kind of like talk about without talking about it. But basically, for me, I really didn't care for the character of Angel, and the spin-off. I'd heard Angel was a really good show, so I was like, well, I'm watching Buffy. I might as well give it a go. Watched the first season of Angel, and I was like, that show was pretty much exactly what I thought it was going to be. I didn't really care for it, but I was like, out of loyalty, I was like, I might as well just persevere and just see what it goes. And there's a cliffhanger. I think it's maybe like close to the halfway mark in season 2, and that was the first time for me. There's a few great cliffhangers. I mean, there's a number of great cliffhangers in Angel, but that moment I remember. And all I'll say about it is doors. So if you ever watch it, then hopefully that will like you wouldn't possibly know what's going on, but as after you've seen it, you might go, okay, that is what he was talking about.
Okay.
But that to me made the show interesting. That was the first time I was like, okay, they're now not doing what I thought they were going to do with this show. There's like it feels like they actually have like a bit of a direction. That to me was the show kind of justifying itself, which I don't think it did in the first season. So yeah, I think for me that was like a pretty like big moment in both those shows, because it genuinely I suddenly cared for like the spin-off, and I ended up liking Angel more than Buffy, which was a huge surprise.
That's funny because when you were saying that there, I remember us having discussions about it because I had been watching Buffy, and I remember you being super into Angel. So when you were chatting about it there, I was like, what am I misremembering?
No, yeah, like it's weird. I had the biggest 180 on that show.
Love it.
Like it was, and it wasn't like that one moment went from it being like I don't like this show to I like it more than Buffy, but the show that happened like more over time. But it was just that was the first time where like the show kind of justified itself to me. So yeah, terrific show. And the cliffhanger is kind of what started that. So I guess now that we've kind of discussed the goods, it makes sense to do the inverse. And do you think do you have any examples of bad cliffhangers, or in your opinion, what makes a bad cliffhanger? What is like? Do you think they're cheap or unearned or?
So I've got like 3 different examples, and they're different. Like I'll go into them as I'm discussing them. So I'll just jump right in. The first one is just a bad cliffhanger. and that was again The Walking Dead. um, and I don't know if you're gonna be able to guess it, but it's that bit when Glenn dies, when he's on the dumpster surrounded by all those walkers.
So I never watched that far, but I remember people talking about it, and I think I even like did a quick cursory search of like worst cliffhangers, and it came up.
Wow, this was so basically, for context, Glenn is on top of this dumpster with this character it's been established that he's just a horrible person. Like, we're not meant to like this character. So Glenn's on top of the dumpster with him, surrounded by walkers, right? And this is a good. When did you stop watching? Do you remember what season?
The start of season 5 somewhere.
So at least 5 seasons in. So we were pretty familiar with what happens when there's groups of walkers around. So this guy was very clearly set up for some kind of redemption. Like, that was the one and only reason he was there. That's like we were talking about those cliches where it's the character who's been introduced 2 episodes previously. Like, this was him. And then they're surrounded by all these walkers, and this guy has this moment where he decides, completely out of character, that he's going to redeem himself and he's going to sacrifice himself so that Glenn can get away. Because he's so much more important than anyone else. But then I genuinely was so angry that I can't, like, I haven't let it sit in my brain, so I can't really remember the exact way it happens, but basically it appears that Glenn is dragged down into the walkers and is eaten, of course. But literally, I was watching it, and it was so painfully, glaringly obvious that Glenn was not dead. But it was like the exact opposite of the Sherlock one, where it was blatantly obvious that Glenn was still alive. And then there was that ridiculous, like, it wasn't even any kind of mystery, like, oh, how did he survive? It was, how are they going to try and get away with this? Do you know what I mean? Like, the writers. And basically, I'm sure it cut to black, and you could hear all the noises of the walkers, and you could hear people screaming, and you're like, oh my god, that must be Glenn. And then literally the next episode was him lying underneath the dumpster under his dead pal. Like, it was just, that was one of the, like your Angel cliffhanger, that was one of the big moments where I was like, I'm really getting really done with this show. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, so that was my example of a bad just a bad cliffhanger. Another example I wanted to talk about was not necessarily a bad cliffhanger. I feel like it had all the kind of hallmarks of a good one, but it just really like changed the trajectory of the show, in my opinion. And that's the season finale of Orange Is the New Black, where just before the season with the prison riot. Have you seen that? Did you watch it? You didn't watch it all, did you?
I watched season 1, and I think I just kind of like fell away from it. I think I watched season 1 like not long after it came out. So at one point I was like technically up to date with Orange Is the New Black, and then just
love it
for whatever reason, because I was enjoying it. I think for whatever reason I just kind of like fell away from it. But only I think I watched like an episode or 2 of season 2, so it didn't even take long for me to fall away from it. It just kind of happened almost immediately.
I do love Orange Is the New Black, I'm not even gonna lie. I even like the seasons that people don't particularly like.
How many seasons are there?
I think 5 or 6, I think.
Wow.
And I always think it's funny, literally, like, everyone on the planet hates Piper Chapman, but I will defend her till the day I die. But that's a discussion for a whole different podcast. She does have her issues, I'll say that, but in case anyone starts to get raging. But again, I'm rambling. Exactly. So basically, this season finale is the whole kind of season leading up to this point. There's been tension building in the prison. The guards are really inappropriate, and they're doing things that are illegal, and etc. And one of the characters is killed by a guard. So the other characters start to, like, they lose it. They just absolutely lose it, and then it kind of culminates in everyone meeting kind of in this one hallway. And there's 2 guards in the middle, and basically they're overpowered. One of them drops their gun, and one of the prisoners, Daya, grabs it, and the season basically ends with her standing pointing a gun at the worst. Of course, it was the worst guard there. Yeah, and that was it. And I was watching it up to date. That was one of the ones, possibly, obviously not super recent, but I was watching it up to date, and I had to wait like over a year to find out what happened, because by this point Daya was a wee bit rogue. Like, she could just do, like, she was a loose cannon, to say the least.
Yeah.
So there was that genuine mystery, like, did she shoot him? Did she shoot to kill? Like, do you know what I mean? But the reason I put it in this part of the podcast was, like I was saying, it definitely completely changed the trajectory of the show. I feel it kind of, and I think it is important for TV shows to kind of discuss things that are relevant and ongoing, especially a TV show like that where there was a lot of different representation and things like that. It was really good at presenting issues like that, but I feel like it very much became that was the show's focus instead of maybe like the characters. Especially, we'd followed them for so long, and it's such like a like it's set in a prison, so there's only so many characters, so you get to know them, you get to know the setting and everything, and then it completely changes its focus. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've written here season 5, it must have been the end of season 4, so I really like season 5, but I can definitely see that why people had issues with it. And I think a lot of that stemmed from that particular cliffhanger, because, like I was saying, the show was a different show before that cliffhanger. So yeah, that's kind of why I included it there, because I thought that was quite interesting. Where it had such a huge impact. It wasn't just like maybe that's what we're talking about, where they've changed slightly. It wasn't just like a fun little mystery, like who shot who kind of thing. It was very much like it just changed the game from that point on. And then the last one I wanted to mention very briefly was in Game of Thrones, towards the end, when it was Jon Snow and Ramsay Bolton having their battle, and there was obviously that moment where it looks like Jon's being crushed. And I have a lot of issues with the latter half of Game of Thrones, but that was a very, like, that particular bit was so, like, visceral. Like, it felt like, I remember watching it again, I watched that at the time, and it felt very much like I was struggling to breathe. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it was, that particular bit was done so well. But the reason it's in here is that, like that thing, I knew that they weren't going to kill Jon Snow. Do you know what I mean? Like, somehow he was going to get out of it. And because he was going to get out of it, there was that kind of expectation that it was going to be ridiculous. The reason, like, a definite, like, Ex Machina, like, someone swoops in from nowhere, and that's pretty much what happened. But yeah, so those are my I feel very different examples, but I feel like each of them warranted talking about.
No, I really like your examples. I think you've gone for very different ones than I have. I really like your picks and why you picked them. For me, I've kind of gone for I've only got a couple, and they kind of like conform to the same pattern. So one of them I'll mention is, so I was talking about Doctor Who before. Doctor Who is a spin-off, again, modelled after Buffy, so like as a spin-off, modelled after Angel. So Doctor Who spin-off Torchwood, which is
like
a show with
John Barrowman?
Yes, controversially now. And yeah, and it's a show with, like, you know, highs and lows, but like the highs are like Children of Earth, which is like the show's third season. It is so interesting because it just becomes a different show. Like, literally they just go like, okay, well, we did this thing for season 1 and 2, and now for season 3 it's just going to be like a 5-part drama, almost like a sort of political drama with like sci-fi elements, and it goes to like, it's probably like one of the best like 5 hours of television you would ever watch, and it goes to like some really like sort of harrowing places. Again, it's Russell T Davies kind of at his best, which is just like showing you how bad a species we are. Just how much we really should not be. We don't deserve to live. But yeah, season 4, they basically took the show to America, again controversially, and it's weird because it kind of felt like it was a sort of they kind of stick to the template of season 3, so they do like this time it's like a 10-part series, and again it's like one sort of concept that they play out, and it's a really interesting premise, which is basically like one day Out of nowhere, suddenly every person on Earth can't die, and they take it to really interesting places. It's really interesting, like exploration of the concept, because they treat it as like a terrible thing, because it's not that you can still suffer, you can still be injured, you just can't switch off basically, and they do really like play with the horror of that, especially with like domestic abuse and overpopulation and things like that, and like convicted murderers and pedophiles, and sort of what that does in terms of like sentencing and like the law, but basically the whole season kind of like, it does feel very Americanized, and it does this thing that the show hadn't really done before, and I kind of hate when shows do it. I understand why they do it, but I kind of hate when shows do it. I guess Doctor Who kind of does it. I did just kind of say that in the previous one, but they basically end the fourth season on a cliffhanger, and it's not a great cliffhanger. It does very much feel like it's just thrown in there to be like, oh, this is like the most shocking thing that could happen in this moment. It feels very sort of cheap, very sort of Americanized. And then the shows just never come back. Like, the show is like...
Oh, no. That's like the worst nightmare, isn't it?
Which is why I hate American shows doing it, because there's so many shows that do it and then get cancelled. And you're just like, great, so now the show permanently just ends on a cliffhanger. And it's annoying, because it's like the show there's 3 seasons of the show before, in which they closed it basically, and then of course the one where they're like, okay, now we're going to go for the big juicy cliffhanger, they then just like never come back and continue it.
I love it, because if it's been cancelled, they've obviously not had time. Like, if it was ending and they wanted to end it on a cliffhanger, you can do a lot of work like before that, leading up to it. But if it's just been cancelled, like, then there's absolutely no resolution. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Another one I wanted to mention, which is a show that just like, again has like some genuine highs, but like mostly lows, and that's Heroes. Did you ever watch Heroes?
I didn't. I've heard that the first season's amazing, and then it rapidly goes downhill.
I actually have a lot of love for like later parts of the show. I probably am like a lot more positive on Heroes than like than most people. So like I actually do give like a lot of time to the later seasons, but it's just the whole thing was a mess, and the writer's strike is kind of like the biggest thing that affected it, because they literally like cut season 2 in half. And
what a wild time that we lived through.
I know, yeah, I know. And there's just, as a result, there's just things that are like set up, because you can tell that the writers were just like literally making up as they went along, and they were just putting stuff in there to sound and look as dramatic as possible. They then
like
never had any.
Did it feel like a first draft?
It just the cliffhangers were always just like, oh well, they would like write these huge cliffhangers until like the end of the season, and then, or even like the end of the mid-season, and then they would be like, okay, now when we go to write the rest of the season, we'll figure out what we're going to do about that. Like,
yeah.
Which, again, a lot of shows do that. Like, don't get me wrong, like I'm not, I know that is like kind of how it works, but they just didn't really seem to be, they didn't really seem to care that much for their own continuity. So you had things, I think the most famous example is in season 2, character Nathan is like seeing this Irish girl. They end up in like a bit of a relationship. She's like his new love interest. And then he takes her to the future at one point, because they had a whole thing in the show where like occasionally a character would jump into the future and it'd be like the end of the world, and it would be like the show's way of showing you like this is the inevitable like fate that's coming your way and they have to stop it. And for whatever reason they get like separated, and he goes back in time, like without before he kind of meant to, and she just gets left in the future and then never seen or heard from again.
Oh no.
And he doesn't. Yeah, that's it. That's the character just gone, and it's so weird. And it was just because of the writer's strike, but they just never bothered to go back or even like have a moment where they like tried to like explain that one away. It literally just like she's like a pivotal character. She's like the love interest and of like basically the show's main character, and then just gone.
I love that. You can almost hear the writers, like if anyone's like, whatever happened, you can almost hear the writers being like, shh. Okay.
Exactly. And I think it's still season 2 where like there's like that season ends and there's all these like things that happen in the last episode. There's like a character on the phone and she's like speaking to someone, she's like, you just opened Pandora's box, and then someone gets shot, and then season 3 opens and you can very much tell either it's like a new team of writers or the writers have just been like, right, we're basically just taking the show in a new direction, because all the ways that they resolve the cliffhanger, which granted I really like the way that season 3 starts off. I think it starts off great, but there's just like a complete disconnect because even though it kind of works, you can tell that they've just retconned the thing that they like wrote into the show. So yeah, heroes right across, and I'm pretty sure the show also ended on a cliffhanger. And I think I remember at the time, season 4 it ended. I think I remember at the time the writers going into season 4, they kept saying in interviews, they were like, we know that season 4 is not going to be the last season. I think that's why they ended it on a cliffhanger, because they were like, we're definitely going to do more. And to be fair, they originally like commissioned 2 like TV movies for them to wrap everything up. And then for whatever reason that fell through, and so it ended up being the case that the show ended on this cliffhanger that again just never gets resolved. So it's just like another one of those things, which is to be fair, looking back, it's very on brand for the show.
That's funny.
Yeah. So those are my picks. But anyway, now that we've kind of discussed cliffhangers, obviously I mentioned this episode being a bit different. So the way that we're sort of approaching this one is there's a new show that's aired on, I think it's BBC One. I know that Netflix are sort of like airing it or sort of like launching it in other countries. So the first half of the season has now aired, and the second half of the season airs this week. And the show is called Inside Man. It's created by Stephen Moffat, directed by Paul McGuigan, and stars Stanley Tucci, David Tennant, Dolly Wells, and Lydia West. So yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the first half of the season and just see where we're at in terms of like thoughts. I went into this one pretty blind. I just was following it because I have like a big love for Stephen Moffat. But yeah, I'd sort of picked this one hoping that we would get a good cliffhanger at the halfway point, and it would feed this discussion. I mean, there is a cliffhanger, I'll say that much just now, which is like, it would have been really awkward if there wasn't. So, Kathryn, first of all, what are your thoughts on the show at the halfway point?
So far, I really like it. I feel like this is definitely one of those shows that I could find myself like throughout the day thinking about, just kind of wondering about it. Or I feel like it's very well written. I feel like it's really clever and interesting. It's definitely got, I feel like, I don't know, there's elements that feel quite different to other shows. I feel like, obviously, just for context, there's it's almost like it's like yourself. I went in completely blind, didn't even know Stanley Tucci was in it. Literally all I had seen of it is you had sent a picture and it was David Tennant dressed as like a vicar. That was all I knew going in. So I think that was really good. I feel like it was a fun way to go into it, because I feel like especially now, especially because you and I keep up to date with, or I try to anyway, up to date with like film and TV and things like that, you tend to know a lot about something before you, and as a former film student, I feel like there's nothing more fun than looking into a movie, as sad as that is.
Yeah.
So it was really fun to go into it blind, but yeah. So for context, there's almost like two different. It feels very much like almost like two different shows. There's like, you've got your kind of the British story, and the elements in that feel very British. The characters are all very British, like not quite stereotypes, but getting there. And then there's like the American side of it, again, feels very Americanized, which I feel like it's going to be really interesting to see to what extent they kind of intertwine. Obviously they're kind of doing it already. They're kind of there is a narrative link, but I feel like it'll be really interesting to see where that goes. But I really I wanted to talk more about the kind of David Tennant side of it, which was the more kind of British side, and I feel like it's. I kind of I love this idea that it's gone, like just one little thing, one little misunderstanding, and it's literally everything has fallen apart for this man. And it's done so well, it's so like subtly done that you can understand each step of what has gone wrong, and it's written in such a way that it's genuinely like, oh god, he is properly backed into a corner. How is he going to get out of this? But at the same time, you're like, it's partly his own fault, but then again, it's not. Like, it's really, I feel like there's no, in that particular storyline, there's not a character there that's, except one obvious character, there's not a character there that's like truly at fault. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, hugely the fault of David Tennant's character. It's not the fault of his son or the maths tutor. I always want to say that she's a piano teacher though for some reason, and I can't tell you why.
Yeah, I get that as well. Actually, you get more piano vibes than math. Yeah.
That's just poor casting, but we'll let that one slide.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there was definitely. I feel like there's each character already is very well established. I feel like even though we're only 2 episodes in, characters are doing things, and I'm like, yeah, that seems like something that character would do. Which again is very nice, a very good testament to the writing, as I've said. I also feel like there's such like some of it's verging on being really funny, but like in such a nice kind of serious way. Like there was one hilarious part. Obviously, this spoiler alert. Basically, things get out of hand, and the maths tutor / piano teacher is trapped in the basement, right, of David Tennant's home. And he's the town vicar, and then there's one point where he's discussing what to do with his wife, and she pulls out the menu for the Chinese restaurant and is like, oh, well, take these down to her and see what she wants. And I just thought that was like the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life, and it was so like on brand with, because I feel like there's nothing British people love more than like having a Chinese takeaway on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're extending that to their captive, someone that they have taken hostage, essentially. They're like, oh, but she deserves a Chinese if we're having one. I feel like that's such a nice, because the inciting incident was so like dark and graphic. It's nice to have that kind of comic relief. I also feel like I really like this. Like I've said, it feels like it's believable. I really like this kind of struggle of David Tennant as the vicar, who he is doing these bad things. Like he's accidentally kind of basically is holding this woman hostage, but he's struggling so hard, like morally, like what to do. What he's trying to do is what's best for everyone, but it's just gotten so out of hand. But there was a couple of moments where I was like, oh my god, he's gonna kill her. He's the vicar and he's gonna kill her. And then there was a moment as well where he was in the church with I can't remember the character's name, the guy.
Edgar.
Yeah, he's in the church with him, and I was like, he's not gonna kill him inside the church, is he? I feel like that's a little bit of like watching all these really dramatic kind of American shows, that's why I was thinking that, and it wouldn't have made sense had he done that. But yeah, I feel like I'm as I was saying, it's definitely one of those shows. And I had watched the first episode with my fiance actually, and he had said, I was like, oh, do you want to watch the second episode tonight? And he was like, I don't know, I couldn't stop thinking about it today. And he didn't end up watching it. I was like, well, I'll watch it and then I'll let you know how it goes, because it's very like I was saying, it's really, when you think about it, it's really dark. But I feel like it feels like new as well. I feel like I can't think of anything that I've seen similar, except the kind of like American part that I was talking about with Stanley Tucci. I feel like we've seen that before, but I have full faith that there's going to be something different going on there.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I am as well, and I think like you said, it's funny because that's you saying it being like two different shows is very, very spot on, and I'm very much with you in that because the show basically posits this question, or not question, but this sort of moral philosophy that Stanley Tucci says, which is like, anyone could be a murderer if given a bad enough day and a good enough reason, and and that the show like presents that sort of like thesis, and then just like sort of plays with it and uses it explores it through David Tennant's character, and it takes a vicar and it engineers the situation in which you do, like you say, you do fully believe that he is quite possibly going to murder someone. And that is, like you say, it's almost like sort of Coen Brothers-esque, I think, almost like sort of Fargo-y type thing, where you just have like a sort of ordinary-esque person, and they're in this like, this really like bleak, this sort of spiraling situation, and they're just like trying to sort of regain control of it, and they're trying to do like the right thing and the logical thing, and it just everything just kind of keeps slipping away from them, and I think it does that really well, and it is, you say, it's just at its most interesting when you're kind of like just watching this character backed against this wall, and the ways in which they kind of like react and respond, and the show is very good at like, it's, again, it's rather than just having it like be that situation and then that's it and it's like static, there's all these like new, like, obviously she mentions the Skype call, and there's the son coming home, and even just like the character of the math / piano teacher, such a piano teacher.
I love that we were both getting those vibes.
It's so weird but so specific, and I like, I really like her character. I love the whole.
She's so clever. Like, I love that. Sorry to interrupt, but
no,
she's got like, I love this idea. A lot of shows are kind of playing with it more and more, that everyone in the world's obsessed with true crime. Do you know what I mean? So when she has her explanation, like, oh, I've cut myself so that I'm bleeding and my blood's all over the room, like, it's so clever, because I would like to think that I would be able to do that, but I would just be in a blind panic. So yeah, I think she's really clever. I love her, like, the way that she just speaks to people, the way that she delivers her lines, and I love the fact as well that she's kind of playing the husband and wife against each other. That obviously kind of comes towards the end of the episodes. Sorry, I hijacked your point there.
Not at all. No, and like, again, it's something I wanted to hear your thoughts on it, because her character I think is the most interesting, and it's because it's like, again, she, like you say, she almost has like more power than them, and that's so interesting how they've taken this character that should basically just be this victim, and they've made her as interesting as possible. And given her as much like agency as possible, and like you say, that she's kind of like over analyzing the situation, and she almost like, David Tennant comes down to talk to her, and she basically tells him what's going to happen and what's like, because she's down there and all she's doing is thinking about it, and that's what, like you say, kind of what you would do. You would just be down there thinking about it, and I love the fact that she takes all these like logical sort of steps, and even things like the bit where she's like in the dark and she's had the lights off because she's like, I was trying to like get my eyes to adjust to the dark because I thought it'd be an advantage. Things like that it's like I think she's just a great character, and it makes those scenes way more interesting than they could be, because it gives them, it feels like there's like a genuine sort of danger there for like the vicar and his wife, and it doesn't feel like they have as much power as they do, but at the same time, because of the fact that she has this power, it then also like sort of compels the whole like, oh, is he going to kill her thing, because it's not a case of, it's not a moral question of like, well, is he going to kill her just because he kind of has to? It's a question of like, okay, well, like, like, she is actually dangerous, in a sense.
I love the idea as well that it's
captive.
Like, I love the idea that it's like it's not like physical brute strength. She's not like got something like a shiv hidden behind her back. Like, it's much more interesting that she's going to potentially like mind game her way out of this. And that feels a lot more new as well, than what we've seen before. Especially, she could be sitting down there like just whimpering. I mean, like, I wouldn't be, but like sitting down there like tied to the structure of the, I don't know what you would call it, trusses. Like, it's definitely a lot more interesting. It feels a lot more new and fresh that she's smart about it, that she's thinking it through. And I feel like there's a lot more scope for where it could go. There's a lot more mystery there.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't feel as inevitable as it otherwise could. And like you said, I'm intrigued by like the Stanley Tucci stuff as well. But it does feel a bit more. I guess that's like the kind of almost like, that's the. I realized sort of in the second episode, I was like, oh, that is like the actual structure of the individual episodes is through the Stanley Tucci thing, because it's basically, he has like a case that he solves every episode. In the first episode, it's obviously the therapists, and then the second episode it was the guy with the awards,
the missing husband.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that they have this show where there's an ongoing narrative, but there's also these like episodic, you'll have like a sort of fulfilling story in that sense. And I think it's an interesting way to sort of like do the show, and also even the way that they do that is like, in the first episode it's like his cellmate, or like the guy in the next cell over he's kind of like talking back and forth with. In the next episode it's Lydia West's character, so even then it's like using the sort of formula of the show to kind of like develop and like further sort of explore the characters and their relationships and the way that they're kind of like behaving. So I think it is very well done.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the subject of Inside Man, so the cliffhanger, obviously that is the theme of the episode, the theme of our podcast episode, and Inside Man does, as mentioned, utilise cliffhangers both at the end of episode 1 and the episode 2. What are your thoughts on the cliffhanger in general? Do you think it was like a strong cliffhanger, a weak cliffhanger? Do you think it served its purpose?
At the end of episode 2?
At the end of episode 2.
I feel like there was a tiny little bit of me that knew that something was gonna happen. Obviously, there was a nice twist where, like, basically, again, spoiler, David Tennant essentially agrees or decides upon himself to sacrifice himself, and that's again such an interesting one because we won't go into it, but there's obviously like a kind of stereotype. We'll leave it at that. So for him to decide to do that, I think that was such a nice point for it to be like, oh, he is genuinely trying to help people. Like, he's sacrificing himself for something as horrific as that. So I knew that would, like, from like, if you think about TV, there's like rules almost. Like, my mum always talks about when like the bad guy gets his comeuppance kind of thing. So I kind of I assumed that something would be happening to Edgar. Like, he wasn't just going to get off scot-free, especially with a show that kind of has already showed us that it's quite clever. And so I knew that something was going to happen there. So when it happened, when it showed that obviously this isn't like the main, I would argue that this the fact, again, it's spoilers, that he hangs himself at the end, that wasn't really the cliffhanger. Like you were saying, it's a lot more kind of subtle than that. The cliffhanger, I feel, was like the note that he left, where he basically said, don't trust the vicar, he's protecting someone. And obviously the build-up is that he is trying to convince the maths tutor that it wasn't, the thing that she saw on the laptop didn't belong to his son. Yeah. So there was like an amazing moment where you saw that note where I was like, oh my god, people are they're gonna relate that to his son. He's gonna, if David Tennant comes forward and they've obviously found this note, they're gonna be like, well, we've got an idea that it wasn't you. And then if and when the maths tutor gets released, do you know what I mean, she's gonna be like, it was the son, and then it all comes together from that. So I feel like that was such a, like, potentially the hanging itself wasn't particularly shocking, but him leaving that note, like. And then there's the cliffhanger as well. Did he do that maliciously? Was he so like delusional that he didn't think that he was in the wrong? Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there was an element of that his interpretation of the note, his interpretation of how he wrote the note isn't the same as what it was read as. So yeah, I feel like it was a cleverly done, and I feel like it was disguised as something else. I feel like it was disguised as the hanging, but then the kind of note at the very last second as well. I'm sure that's the last thing that you see. I remember turning to, actually he wasn't even in the room, but I remember sitting there in the room like, oh my god, they're gonna think it was the sun. So I feel like fun isn't the right word, but do you know what I mean? It wasn't like campy and cheesy, but there was definitely an element of like, oh my god, like, this is gonna get good.
I agree. I think it's a very well done cliffhanger for the reason that you say that it kind of leads you to think it's one thing, and then it actually reveals no, there's more to this than what you thought. And I think it's so interesting because like there is this sort of moral question throughout, again, with it being a vicar that they've chosen to sort of go on this crisis. And to test this sort of like thesis, and you do have it does kind of like toy with this idea, doesn't it, of like, is that the vicar character, is David Tennant's character, is he a good man, or is he not? Is this just like something that he says he is? Does he actually live up to? And it does show him like genuinely trying, like you say, trying to save everyone and trying to live up to his ideals. And it is quite a nice subversion, isn't it, of like, of a holy man actually playing it straight and being like, this guy genuinely does want to do good, even though he has a woman tied up in his basement that he's probably going to murder.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing as well. That's what adds to like the watchability of those parts of the show, is like that, like you have this like question that's been posed, and then you also have this like moral question of like his character, and like can he still be good? Is he still good? And yeah, he is trying to do the noble thing. He is trying to like make this sacrifice, and yeah, it backfires. And yeah, that's what the cliffhanger is so good, because with just a note, it does spell all this out, and it puts these characters into like immediate danger. They don't even know about it. I think that's another thing that like cliffhangers can do quite well, is like it puts characters into danger. That's part of the fun, is like you're now kind of ahead of the characters, because you know that there's this danger coming for them that they haven't been faced with yet. So yeah, they are like sort of in peril without even realizing it, and the delivery of the cliffhanger is like kind of pitch perfect, with like leaving the last frame being like, okay, that is like the sort of information that you just get, and like you say, it's done in such a way which the character doesn't realize the full like Edgar doesn't realize the full implications of what that note could do. So yeah, no, I'm very, very interested in sort of seeing where it goes forward. I think it does its job in making you want to. I keep thinking about the show, not just like in terms of like it being an interesting show, but like just in terms of like the questions it sort of put forward without even like really realizing I was thinking about it. It just has come up on like a lot where I've wound up thinking about the questions and the sort of stuff it's exploding, which is good. It's what you want from a TV show, and I'm very interested in seeing like, because I think it's interesting as well because there's still two episodes to go, because it does feel like it feels like it could be wrapped up in an episode. So I'm interested in seeing where what other sort of twists and turns it takes over the next two. Do you have any theories as to not necessarily just like how the cliffhanger will be resolved, but just like going forward, what might happen with characters or like with the storyline?
I feel like I can only assume that Stanley Tucci obviously has a much bigger role in kind of solving the kind of mystery, but in the same token, he's obviously at this point they don't know. None of the characters that are dealing with kind of Stanley Tucci knows David Tennant's character. It's just that the link is the maths tutor, obviously, and that's who they're focusing on. And at this point, they don't know who. They've just got that kind of blurry picture where his face isn't in it. I can't remember if he's got his collar on in the picture, which I assume if he does, that will be noticed by Stanley Tucci, and then it'll be narrowed down from there. But I feel like it's like the issue with the maths tutor is such an impossible situation that she's explained that herself. Like, there's no way you can let me go, and his wife has spoken about it as well. There's no way we can let her go because she's going to go straight to the police. But can we kill her? Like, it's such an impossible situation that I don't know how they're going to resolve that. Like, I couldn't even hazard a guess, because if it was me and someone chucked me down the stairs and locked me in a basement, hell yeah, I would be going straight to the police. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. I feel like I don't know. Honestly, it's one of those ones where the more you think about it, the almost like the harder it becomes to think of how it's going to resolve.
Yeah, exactly. I think what's interesting is, like you say, and the show almost kind of ignores this to a degree. When it's kind of like, because they obviously the vicar and his wife, and they keep saying, if we let her go, she's going to go to the police, and the danger of that is that she'll tell about the pictures, and the son will be accused, and that's going to be the problem. But they keep kind of like skimming over the fact that like she also now can just go to the police about the fact that she's been tied up in the basement for
yeah, I'm like, you guys are still going to get done with assault and kidnapping. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that itself is like, there's not really, you can't even if you clear yourself of like, okay, like the main thing they are worried about is their kid, which again I think is why it's a really interesting way of doing it, because it's that is the danger. Is it's not actually a danger like to them. It's to their sort of family, and it's all about protecting their sort of family.
It's such an interesting point as well, because they make such a good point that it's, even though we as the audience also know it's not true, it's the accusation. All that it needs is for that accusation to be out there, and then the son's life is ruined. Because even if it's proven that it wasn't him, there'll still be that little thing. Like, you know what it's like, if you hear something, even if, so you might not hear the end of the story, you don't know that he's been cleared. So there's always, like, going to be that thing in your mind. So they're right, his life will be ruined just by that accusation. So the stakes are high. Like, it's such a good show.
And it's a really interesting thing to do in, like, this sort of contemporary era where, like, that is a very sort of modern problem, like the circulation of information and misinformation and just the way that our sort of attraction to gossip and to, you know, you do flock to, like, the ugly truths, and people do make up their minds. They make assumptions and assertions before, like, and it uses that. It's interesting taking that and making that kind of like the central sort of threat. And it's I think it's very interesting seeing where they're going to go, and I'm curious by, you know, at the end of the day, I'm very curious by, like, obviously Dolly Wells' character, the math/piano teacher, because she, I mean, I don't actually know where the show is going, like, broadly speaking. Like, that I feel like is kind of impossible to predict, because, like you say, it doesn't, there's not, and that's what's good about it, is there isn't, like, an obvious way to resolve everything on, like, a nice, neat way. It does feel like there has to be. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say quickly, it was really funny when I was thinking about it, like, just out of interest, like, how would you resolve that? In my head, I was like, the only way he can do it is if he kills her and then burns the house down. Like, I feel like that's not going to solve anything, really. He's now going to have even more issues that he's homeless.
Yeah.
So...
It's
on top of being a murderer.
Yeah. Yeah, on top of living with that. But it's an option, just putting it out there.
I'm like, maybe what to think about it.
I think for me, and I don't know how this is going to come up, and I could be completely wrong here. The one that because the show is really, Stephen Moffat as a writer is really good at planting little seeds and then paying them off in, like, very surprising ways. And you kind of see that in the show already. He's very good at, like, details, and you know, you have that with, like, the individual cases with, like, you know, the whole therapist thing, and then obviously the guy with the award, and, like, the way it will give you, like, really subtle sort of planted information. And sometimes the show will tell you something and make it seem like it's really obvious, and then, like, it almost allows you to forget about it and then brings it back. And the one thing that I feel like hasn't really been used. They keep like, it just, the show has introduced it, and it's such an interesting thing. And this also probably, I recently watched the Hitchcock film The 39 Steps, and this weirdly actually uses, like, a similar sort of device, but they have this idea of the cellmate, or the guy in the next cell over, who is this, like, human, like, recording device. You know, he remembers everything. He has this, like, photographic memory, and I really, you know, I actually do. He's to me is, like, the most interesting character in those, like, scenes, just because I think he's quite funny. I like what they've done with his character. But I feel like that's got to be something that's used in some way. You know, I feel like it's such an interesting idea, having this character who, you know, literally just remembers everything. And I feel like he's got to be integral to, like, the payoff somehow. No idea how.
Yeah, because he's quite a big part. Like, he's in it equally as much as Stanley Tucci's character. You know, like, why would he be there if it wasn't relevant in some way? That's such a good point. Exactly.
So my eyes are very much on him, because I think he's going to be used. Another thing that, unlike the other side, on the Dolly Wells thing, obviously they've set up the whole, she wants them to log into her Skype account and send an email to her sister. So that's an interesting one, because obviously they do kind of, like, they kind of tell you without telling you that, like, that's a trap on her end, because obviously she willingly gives David Tennant the password. Like, she almost, like, fights against him to give him the information against his will.
Because he doesn't want it. He's like, no. I don't need it. And then she's like, oh, here's the password.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm interested to see where that's going, but that's a bit more of an obvious hook. One thing that I think might I don't know, but one thing I think might pay off with her character is they've made a point of like having the whole lights on, lights off thing, and she's gone from like sitting in the dark to then asking them to leave the lights on the last like I think couple times where like they've gone down to visit her. She does also now have, which I don't know if she's drank it or not. I think it might be empty, or at least it looks like she's drank it.
Glass bottle.
Well, yeah, the bottle of whiskey. So I don't know if there's going to then be. I don't know if there's a link between. I don't know if she's. I mean, you mentioned there being a fire. I feel like, fire would be a very.
She's got my idea.
Yeah, well, I don't. I mean, again, I don't know exactly how she would use it. I don't know if she would just set a fire in the basement and hope that they would like, out of panic, come down to rescue her. Which is possible. That's
such a good point. I feel like there's definitely. Sorry, I feel like there's definitely scope for her, almost to like sacrifice herself, to kind of trap the vicar. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like there is the potential that she uses a glass bottle on herself. I feel like that's not out the realms of possibility. Yeah,
I can definitely I definitely feel like the. I don't know. I feel like the light being on, the light existing, and the like her having this like flammable liquid. I feel like there's got to be a connection there because like
and there's Christmas decorations down there. They would go up like that.
That's true. That is very true. So yeah, those are like the only like major things that I've kind of like picked up on that I think might just have like some use and some payoff down the line. And it's interesting that we're halfway through the show, and those are kind of all I've got.
Yeah, like it's definitely like one of those shows that, like I was saying, the more I think about it, the more I almost like talk myself out of things, and then talk myself into even wilder things.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's a very good show.
No, I'm definitely looking forward to the next the next 2 episodes.
To just finish up. So again, since we've mentioned like morality, what type of ending do you feel like would be most satisfying for the show? Like, do you think there's a happy ending? Do you think a happy ending would be satisfying? Is there characters that you would like to see, like redeemed or rewarded or punished?
I'm always a sucker for a non-happy ending because I feel like they're so overdone, and like I was saying, sometimes it doesn't make sense for the story, but it happens anyway because people like a happy ending. I don't know. I feel like I just want it to feel like it's like I want the story to feel like cohesive almost. Do you know what I mean? I don't want I don't want there to be like something completely out of the blue that happens that solves everything and everything's fine. I feel like there's too much, it's gone too deep now for everything to be okay. So yeah, probably would err on the side of it being not a happy ending. I feel like it's such an impossible, it's not going to be a happy ending for everyone, and there's no like between the kind of maths tutor and David Tennant's character, neither of them are necessarily like, I mean, in that instance David Tennant's kind of the bad guy, but do you know what I mean? Like I said, we can see why he's doing it, we can see that he's trying, but at the same time he has like, he pushed her down the stairs essentially, he like trapped her in his home, so he has done something wrong. I don't know, I'm rambling again because I'm honestly like, it's that way where I feel like we could talk around in circles for hours about the show, which is good. It does definitely make for an interesting discussion. Yeah. What do you think? What are you wanting to see?
I don't know. Again, it's interesting. I feel like I don't think it's going to be like an out and out depressing ending, but I don't. I do think there's going to be. The show's already shown you that there's like comeuppance. And again, it kind of like right from the get-go, Stanley Tucci's character basically says that. He's like, he's like, I don't want to be sentenced to death, but my wife didn't want to be murdered. So it's all about like fairness and balance and morality. And I feel like the show, has made a point of telling you that, so it's kind of going to stick to it. But at the same time, knows that it is like created these likable characters. So I do feel like, I do feel like the show has to kind of honor its like premise and promise, and that it has to kind of deliver on. There has to be like some sort of form of justice, and there has to be some form of like, okay, well, David Tennant's character, yeah, okay, he might have like been justified in a sense in like what he was doing, or you can make that like argument anyway, but there does still need to be like a repercussion for it. So I don't know if he's going to become like the prison vicar. Do prisons have vicars?
Yeah.
Like even that just kind of feels like a bit too clean. I feel like with like the sort of violence that the show's had, I feel like there's probably going to be like a character death at least. I mean, there already has been one, so I feel like, you know, if you have a character hang themselves at the halfway point, then like probably doesn't bode well for everyone surviving to like the credits of episode 4.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like I want there to be some more kind of definitive tie between the two parts, but I can't figure out what it would be because it doesn't, because they're so different. It's difficult to think what would make sense.
Yeah,
for the,
exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very interested to see where the show leaves us, because I think every one of those things that you look back and you go, oh, of course, that's where it was going to go. But like, I genuinely don't know. I mean, it all opened with like a girl getting harassed on a train on like the underground.
Oh my god, that was like painful to watch.
Yeah, I think that was like, I feel like they did a very good job of like, and props to that actor as well, because he does a really good job of just being like so sort of like slimy and seedy, and even like the casting of like him being this really like sort of thin guy, where like he doesn't actually, you know, if you were gonna like, especially when he's like surrounded by people, like he shouldn't have.
He's not like massively imposing in that sense.
Yeah, and he's very much outnumbered, but it's like because he acts confidently and no one wants to get involved. I think it does a really good job of like painting that situation of like, no one really wants to get involved, so he just then has all this power, and he then sort of plays that up. So yeah, and that's again another really good way of sort of introducing like some of the major themes. But yeah, I can't really see like the show bookending with like a similar scene. Maybe Dolly Wells harasses someone, or like. So like, yeah, I have no idea where it's going to go, but I'm very much looking forward to finding out, and it'll be interesting on the next episode to meet and discuss, and hopefully we're satisfied by it.
I think the fact that we've rambled on for so long is so good, because it's going to be a good discussion either way. Even if it ends like terribly, it'll be nice to discuss like, why did it do that, like I think it's props to the show for being so clever in its writing as well, that it'll just make it, just by default makes it an interesting discussion. Yeah,
exactly. But yeah, cool. Till the next time, thank you all for watching, and Kathryn, thank you very much for the discussion, and also Kathryn's cat. Thank you for
special guest.
Yeah, exactly, special guest cat. So yeah, on that note,
thank you for that.
We will leave you until the next time, where we will pick up the rest of this discussion and discuss conclusions. So until then, farewell.
See ya.